Hi, so I've had a lot of requests for this one. I'm going to take you through the basics of religious language. Now, I really am only going to do the basics because, as we can see, there's an awful lot in this topic. So I've done a list here. You could get questions about anything on this list, but you can't get questions about all of the scholars. So I've tried to put a little star next to the scholars who can't appear in questions, but I think the rest probably can, and anything on this list really could come up. So I will take you through the basics. Like I say, that it would be very unwise to just use this video as all of your revision for religious language, because all of these things will need looking at. There's always going to be more than I can talk about. Okay, let's get started. So here's a few definitions that you're going to need, because quite a lot of this topic hinges on a debate about whether religious language is cognitive or non-cognitive. In other words, what sort of language is it? So cognitive language, this conveys factual information, and the way you know it's cognitive language is you can usually test it through sense experience. So a cognitive statement would be something like, there is a dog next door, because even if you don't know at that time, you can go and find out. Non-cognitive language is different. This is language which conveys emotion or makes moral statements, and usually you can't test it through sense experience. So if I was to say something like, dogs are the best animals, that's me making an emotional assertion, or an assertion about what I think. You can't test whether or not that's empirically true. It's just not that kind of a statement. And then we've got analytic and synthetic statements. You probably know about this from other philosophy topics. Analytic statements are true by definition. So that's like 2 + 2 is 4. Synthetic statements are ones that, again, are testable through sense experience, so empirically verifiable, even if they're false. So if I say the dog next door is purple, that's a valid synthetic statement, because even though it's probably not true, we know how to find out. So that's what makes it synthetic. Okay, so let's jump straight into some arguments about why religious language isn't meaningful. So we've got A.J. Ayer first up. He came up with the verification principle, and he argued that if a statement was not verifiable, it was meaningless. It had no meaning, it had no value. If we know how to verify a statement in practice or in principle, it can be said to be meaningful. So the difference there is verifying something in practice means we know how to verify it. We know how to find out. Verifying it in principle could be something like, we know how we would verify it if we could, but we just can't at the moment. So this could be something like, there are aliens on Mars. That can be verified in principle because we could go to Mars and explore all of Mars and have a look. We know how we would verify that statement. We just can't do it at the moment. So that's the test for the verification principle. Ayer reckoned that any statement that can't be verified like this is meaningless. And so for him, that included all religious statements, all statements about God, and also ethical statements, so statements about right and wrong. Ayer didn't think they had intrinsic meaning either, because they're just expressions of approval or disapproval. So Ayer thought that if you say murder is wrong, all you're really saying is, I don't like murder, I don't approve of it. So let's have a look at whether the verification principle is any good. A lot of people don't think it is, because it seems very rigid and very inflexible, and it also seems to go against our experience to say that anything that's not verifiable has no meaning. So if someone tells you that they love you, that would surely be meaningful, but it can't be verified using the verification principle. And it also assumes that there's only one way something can be meaningful. It's a bit like saying that empirical truth is the only truth there can be. Scientific truth is the only truth there can be. And a lot of people would argue that human experience is much more complex than that. Some religious claims could be seen as verifiable in principle. So we could potentially find out that there is a God. This is a little fast forward to Hick's eschatological verification, which we'll come to in a minute. And one of the biggest problems with the verification principle is you can't verify the verification principle using the verification principle. It fails its own test. But it does raise useful questions about what counts as meaningful. It opens up a useful debate about how do we decide what language is meaningful. And it does fit with a scientific approach. And you'll probably see in other topics that many people are big fans of a scientific approach. So it's not all bad. Right, let's move on to the falsification principle. So this was Anthony Flew and Karl Popper. And again, you won't be asked directly about their work, but a really good starting point for understanding the falsification principle is the parable of the gardener, which we've got here. Now, if you've studied the falsification principle at all, you'll probably know this story. It's the idea that even if you have a lot of evidence that something isn't real, if you believe that it is real, you won't let that evidence count for anything. So what this has to do with the gardener is the believer looks at the garden and says, there's been a gardener here. And the non-believer can see no evidence of this. And so he challenges the believer, but the believer just responds every time by saying, oh, maybe the gardener's like this, or maybe the gardener's like that. But then what's the difference between a gardener that we can't see or hear or see any trace of and no gardener at all? So this is Flew utilising this story to help make his point. Let's break it down then. This is a falsification principle. A statement is only meaningful if we know how to falsify it. So if we know how to show that it wouldn't be true. And Flew says you can't do this with religious statements because a believer will never accept the evidence and will cling to their belief. So even if you present a huge amount of evidence to a Christian to argue that there is no God or that Jesus' resurrection didn't happen, the believer will probably say, well, what about this? What about that? Maybe it was like this, maybe it was like that. And they'll ultimately end up saying, well, it doesn't matter because I believe it anyway. And for Flew, this isn't good because he says that therefore religious statements are dying the death of 1,000 qualifications. If you keep tacking bits onto it, it just loses all meaning. So Flew thinks you should never think that it had meaning in the first place. Now, the falsification principle, just to evaluate it for a second, it does make a good point about this because if you are a rational person, it can seem irrational to cling to beliefs in the face of lots of evidence to show that they're false. But he's also doing the same kind of mistake as Flew by suggesting that things are only meaningful if they are factual. And lots of believers allow things to count against their faith claims. Faith changes over time, faith can be challenged, faith can be lost. And the biggest cause of this is the problem of evil. So Flew is making too big an assumption if he says that religious language is meaningless because people never allow anything to count against their faith claims. Often they don't, but sometimes they do. Okay, so this bit that we're getting into now, and we've touched on this already, these are Christian responses to the challenges from verification and falsification. So first up, we've got John Hick and this idea of eschatological verification. Now, Hick tells another story to help illustrate this. It's called the parable of the celestial city. And you can look this up, but to make a long story short, two people are on a road, they're traveling along the road, one thinks they're not going anywhere, The other thinks they're going to a celestial city, like a heavenly city. And they're going to find out when they get there, when they get to the end of the road. Either there'll be a celestial city or there won't be. But Hick's point is we don't find out till we get there. So Hick thinks that religious statements are cognitive, they can be factual, and therefore they can be verified. The truth is out there. There is a truth to know. There is a right answer, but we can't find out till after we die. So if Hick's right about this, this undermines air and flu and the logical positivists, because we will find out one day if religious statements are meaningful, and we'll find this out when we die. Either they'll be verified as true, or there'll be nothing and that will falsify them. We've also got R.M. Hare and the idea of a blick. Now, you've probably come across Blicks before because they're a useful little bit of philosophy, but let's just go through it in this context. So Hare doesn't think that religious language is cognitive. He thinks it's non-cognitive. So it isn't factual, but it's still meaningful. And he says that religious statements are expressions of a blick. A blick is like a worldview, so it can't be falsified because it's just how you see the world. And it's often, it doesn't even have to be empirically true to be meaningful. And a great example of this is the parable of the lunatic. So this is essentially a guy who is absolutely convinced that somebody is trying to kill him. And in fact, nobody is trying to kill him, but you can't tell him that because he's got it in his head that someone's out to get him. And so this completely affects his view of the world. So Hare says that therefore Blicks can't be falsified, but therefore you cannot say they're meaningless, because if this is your blick, if this is your worldview, it will have an effect on how you live your life. Now, not everybody likes this, because a lot of believers would say, well, Hare isn't right to say that religious language is non-cognitive. They would say it is cognitive. It isn't just a matter of an individual worldview, because many believers see it as factually correct that God exists. All right, let's move on to Wittgenstein. Now, he came up with the idea of language games. So again, this is taking a non-cognitive stance on religious language. But he thought that air and flu were wrong because they were just using the language wrong. They were using the language of science to speak about religion. So they were in the wrong language game. It's a bit like saying if you were having a conversation with somebody about cricket, you wouldn't use the language of football because it wouldn't make sense to do that. You wouldn't be able to make your meaning clear. Wittgenstein thought that meaning is usage, so words are made meaningful by the context that they're put into. So if you say the statement, there's a bat over there, that meaningfulness is going to depend on where you are. It could be that you're in a zoo and you're pointing at a bat that's in the zoo, or it could be that you're in a dressing room of a cricket team and it's a cricket bat that you're talking about, but you need that context. Therefore, when religious believers talk about God, they're in their own language game, so it means something to them. But if an atheist tries to join in that language game, they're not going to be able to participate because they don't have the language, they're not in the game. Now, there's a lot that's good about this argument, but there's a few problems as well. If Wittgenstein is right, then it sort of shuts down any possible debate between theists and atheists, because you can't say that either is wrong, you just have to say that they're different, and that makes it very difficult to engage in debate. Right, got a few more scholars and ways of looking at religious language. So this was Aquinas. Aquinas thought that the best way to talk about God was through analogy. And he had two ways of going about it. We've got analogy of attribution and analogy of proportion. So analogy of attribution means that because God made us, he made us with a little of him in us. So this is to do with being made in the image of God, but we can name some of the attributes. So we have a little bit of God's goodness, we have a little bit of God's wisdom, and by looking at the creation, by looking at us, we can tell things about the Creator, and that gives us things to talk about. It gives us ways of speaking about God. They're analogies, so it's comparing one thing to something else, but Aquinas thought that was as good as it could get. An example for this, you probably know this example, is if you look at the urine of a farm animal and the urine is healthy, it follows that the animal is probably healthy. So by looking at something that's produced, we can tell something about the producer. And then analogy of proportion, again, we can look at this from the point of view of us having some of God's qualities, but because God is proportionally much greater than us, it follows that the qualities that we've got, God would have too, but just much, much, much greater. And again, it's not perfect, but it gives us a way into speaking about God. John Hick quite liked this, and he used the example of we can understand the ways in which a dog can be loyal, but then a human is capable of a much greater and more complex level of loyalty. And then if we scale up, the loyalty of God must be much, much, much greater than that. We don't have to understand it all together, but we can understand it in a proportional kind of a way. And then we've got Telek, Paul Telek, German theologian, seeing religious language as symbolic. This is the one that people sometimes struggle with, but that's okay because it's not straightforward what Telek says. Symbols give us a way of talking about God because they point to a deeper reality beyond themselves. So a symbol of Christianity is a cross. And if you showed a cross to a Christian, they wouldn't just see two pieces of wood, one on top of another. It would take them to a kind of spiritual place and a place of deep meaning where they think about the death of Jesus and the love of Jesus and the conquering of good over evil. But the point that Telek's making is the symbol gives us a way in. It points to a reality beyond itself. And symbols contain some of these meanings of what they represent. So something like a national flag, it looks like just a piece of cloth with some colours on it, but actually it might have connotations of patriotism, of pride, of knowing where you come from. And then the next bit, Telek says that God is being itself rather than a being. So God isn't one thing and not all the other things. God is literally sort of ultimate reality. And so it doesn't make sense to talk about God in this kind of really dry cognitive way that we would use to talk about other things, because God isn't a thing at all. God is kind of everything. If you're struggling with that bit, don't worry, because a lot of people do. It's not even clear that Telek knew what he was talking about there. But the upshot is that religious symbols talk to a believer on an emotional level and a spiritual level. They give us that way in. They give us something that then creates this deeper reality for us. So this is good in a way because it aligns very much with what people think happens in religious experience. It also solves some of the problems of anthropomorphism because it gives us a non-anthropomorphic way of talking about God through these symbols. But it's not terribly clear. It's not absolutely clear what Telek was talking about. And also this concept of God as being itself is not something that all Christians would buy into because they have a different understanding of God. Okay, finally, we've got the via negativa. Now, this is a way of talking about God by talking about what God is not. And this comes from the idea that God is so great, God is so completely beyond our understanding, that anything that you say positively about God, so if you say God is this and that, you're always going to be wrong. So the Via Negativa, this came out of a kind of mystical tradition. So we've got mystics like Maimonides and Pseudo-Dionysius articulating this stuff. So to talk about God negatively, this is known as apophatic language. God is completely other. God is completely different than anything we can understand. And so we can only think about what he is not. So a little quote from Pseudo-Dionysius was, God is neither darkness nor light. God is not those things. It's good in the sense that it avoids making God a thing, but this isn't actually how most believers talk about God, and it's not how most believers would want to talk about God. They want to talk about what God is. God is love, God is Father, all this sort of thing. So the Via Negativa probably makes much more sense if you are like a deep mystic, but for most believers, it's not perhaps a terribly helpful way of talking about God. It's a bit too philosophical. Okay, so that's a very quick trip through the basics. What you will need to do is go back over all of that, read your notes, read the book, look things up, ask questions on things you're not sure about. In terms of questions they can set, there's huge scope for 10-mark questions on really any of those scholars I just talked about. If there's a 15-marker, it could be something like this. This idea, is religious language cognitive or non-cognitive? Now, as usual with anything in Christianity, there's not a lot of agreement about this. And most Christians probably don't think about it too much. But a lot of Christians would say that when they talk about God, they mean what they say. They're making factual statements. When they say God is love, that's not just an opinion. They believe that they're making a statement of fact. But non-cognitive approaches have got a lot of strengths. Hare's idea of Blicks is pretty good. Wittgenstein's language games solve some problems. And they reflect the idea that not all religious beliefs are the same. People interpret things differently, people have different beliefs, and so on. So it doesn't actually have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be it's all definitely cognitive or it's all non-cognitive. Some religious statements could be used cognitively while others aren't. So in some ways, maybe the central faith claims, so the absolute building blocks of the faith, could be seen as cognitive, but then the interpretations, developments, offshoots of them don't have to be. Okay, that's enough for now. Hope you've enjoyed this, hope you found it useful. Please remember to subscribe to the channel and feel free to share the videos with anyone who might find them useful, and I'll see you next time.